Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Davenport Streetcar. This is a streetcar that's interesting in that it's not really well known because it never really made it into what we could consider the modern era, having existed only before World War II, but never after it. So, let's get into the video. The origins of the Davenport Streetcar begin in the late 1800s, although Davenport Road predates it by at least a century. Davenport Road was once one of the longest First Nation trails used primarily by the Ojibwe. The trail followed what is now Kingston Road in Queen Street, east of the Don River, and then along what is today Davenport Road to the Humber River. From there, the trail followed what is today Dundas Street. When the United Empire Loyalists settled the area, the trail became one of the routes linking York and Niagara and was given the name Davenport in 1797. Davenport Road would be paved over in 1833 using money collected by toll cottages, which were located every few kilometers along the road. You can still see one of these cottages today at the intersection of Bathurst Street and Davenport Road. The Davenport Streetcar itself would come into existence a couple of decades later at the end of the century. On April 20th, 1891, the village of West Toronto granted a 25-year charter to the newly incorporated Davenport Street Railway Company to operate a service from West Toronto's downtown at Keele Street and Dundas Street to points east. This service was to run from the village's downtown core along Keele Street to St. Clair Avenue. From there, the line would run to Ford Street and then head south to Davenport Road and then points east. This service, beyond serving the village of West Toronto, would also serve the communities of Carleton, Brackendale, and Davenport. The line was to terminate on Bathurst Street at the CP rail tracks, where connections could be made to the Toronto Street Railway lines south of the tracks. Service began on September 6, 1892, although a transfer was required on the route since the tracks didn't cross the Grand Trunk Railway tracks on St. Clair until 10 days later on September 16th. At this time, another railway company was also setting up shop in West Toronto, the Weston, High Park and Toronto Street Railway, which was incorporated on November 12, 1890. This company was given the mandate of building and operating horse-drawn cars in West Toronto, York, and Etobicoke. The company would change its name to the City and Suburban Electric Railway in 1891 before construction began, as it moved away from horse-drawn cars in favor of electric trolleys. The C&SER would operate the Crescent Streetcar, which operated along Dundas Street from Keele Street to Gilmore Avenue. From there, the line would head south and then east to Louisa Street, today known as St. John's Road. From there, the line would then head south on Fairview Avenue to Evelyn Crescent. In 1894, this route would be extended east from Keele Street to Humberside Avenue, where passengers could transfer onto the Toronto Railway Company's Dundas Streetcar. While the two streetcar lines mentioned, the Davenport Streetcar and the Crescent Streetcar, were operated by different companies, there was no competition between the two lines. In fact, there was an idea of merging the two companies and their respective lines into a single network. This merger would occur in February of 1894, when the people behind the Davenport Street Railway and the City and Suburban Electric Railway asked for and received an Act of Parliament from Ottawa authorizing the incorporation of the Toronto Suburban Railway Company. This company would take over operations of the Davenport Streetcar and the Crescent Streetcar. With this, the newly created company would begin expanding its network with the laying of tracks north along Keele Street and Weston Road into the village of Weston. As well, tracks along Dundas Street were extended west from Gilmore Avenue to Lambton Park in 1895. The TSR would be bought out by Sir William Mackenzie, who also owned the Canadian Northern Railway. Under his ownership, further expansion of the network was planned, including interurban service to Guelph in 1901 and service to Woodbridge in 1904. Despite all of this, the Davenport Streetcar itself saw only modest use. The line remained a single-track line with only a passing loop at Lansdowne Avenue. 2 cars would operate along the line, offering a 30-minute service. The line used open cars, and according to James Victor Salmon, would cause the grab bars to become charged in wet weather, giving passengers a good jolt. As well, the quality of trackage along the route had also deteriorated significantly. Partway through its charter, the Toronto Suburban Railway would re-gauge its network from its old broad horse car gauge of 4 foot 10 7/8 inches to standard gauge, which is 4 feet 8.5 inches. This was done as the extension of service to Guelph required the network to be compatible with the Canadian Northern Railway's tracks, which were all standard gauge. This change would take effect on January 30th, 1917, and would be in place until the Toronto Transportation Commission took over operations a few years later. The exception to this rule would be the service to Guelph, which remained in standard gauge. By 1911, the City of Toronto had annexed much of the land served by the Davenport Streetcar, including the village of West Toronto itself in 1909. While the city had this land, they had no way to serve it, as the Toronto Railway Company refused to expand its service into the newly annexed lands, citing such demands were not covered in the original 1891 charter. Because of this, the City of Toronto established its own company, the Toronto Civic Railway, which constructed a line along Lansdowne Avenue. This line would connect with the Davenport Streetcar at the intersection of Davenport and Lansdowne. In 1917, an interlocking signal was installed at the intersection to prevent crashes. TCR crews would set the signal before crossing the tracks and then reset it after crossing the tracks, requiring the operator to get out and run across the street whenever they crossed the intersection. While this was happening, the TSR would extend the Davenport Streetcar east from its current terminus at Bathurst Street to Huron Street along Davenport Road. The ultimate goal was to one day extend the Davenport Streetcar to Yonge Street to offer a better connection to downtown-bound streetcars for passengers. This would have been accomplished by an eastern extension of the line to the Canadian Northern Railway's right-of-way near Poplar Plains Avenue, and then follow that and the CP rail line to Yonge Street and North Toronto Station. The TSR would begin construction on this extension, and the company spent a fair amount of money on it, using heavier rails than what were used on the rest of the route. However, when construction reached Huron Street, work came to an abrupt stop. While it is not known for certain, it is speculated the city intervened in the project, as they had not given Sir William Mackenzie permission to build the extension. By this time, Mayor of Toronto, Tommy Church, and Sir William Mackenzie were not on good terms with each other, and the city was moving forward with its plan to unify all streetcar operations under one city-owned agency. While construction stopped and the line never made it to Yonge Street, for whatever reason, the 800 meters of track that were installed between Bathurst Street and Huron Street were also ripped out of the ground only months after being installed, never having been in service. In 1921, the Toronto Transportation Commission took control of the lines owned by the Toronto Railway Company and the Toronto Civic Railway. Other companies, such as the Toronto and York Radio Railway and the Toronto Suburban Railway, would be brought into the fold at a later date, pending negotiations. However, the TTC would purchase the tracks on Bathurst Street between Davenport Road and the CP rail tracks from the TSR on October 31st, 1921. This was done to allow a northern extension of the Bathurst Streetcar to St. Clair Avenue. On November 15, 1923, most of the Toronto Suburban Railway's operations within the City of Toronto would be handed over to the TTC, although the TSR would continue to operate the lines themselves until the TTC could bring them up to city standards. The Davenport Streetcar would be the first to receive these upgrades. The line along Davenport Road would be double-tracked from Bathurst Street to Old Weston Road, and the line was re-gauged from the standard gauge to the TTC's unique track gauge to make the line compatible with the rest of the network. With that work done, the Davenport Streetcar would be reduced to a shuttle service running between crossovers at Bathurst Street and Dovercourt Road. Service west of there would be handled by the Davenport Streetcar, which operated along Davenport Road to Old Weston Road and then along there to Townsley Loop, just north of St. Clair Avenue. The issue at hand with the Davenport Streetcar was it didn't have a natural terminus, but a forced one brought on by competing companies. In this case, the Toronto Suburban Railway and the Toronto Railway Company. Riders of the Davenport Streetcar wished to travel downtown, however the TSR's mandate and its use of standard gauge at the time prevented its integration with the rest of the streetcar network. The plan to bring the Davenport Streetcar to Yonge Street was an idea to address this problem. Now, however, with the TTC in charge, such divisions no longer mattered, and the Davenport Streetcar, as stated earlier, was regauged to the TTC track gauge. However, this brought on a different question, that question being, where would the line go? By this point, the TTC was extending service on the Bathurst Streetcar to St. Clair Avenue and did not wish to have the Davenport Streetcar duplicate service on Bathurst Street south of Davenport. Some thought was given to the idea of extending the line east, although the TTC could not figure out what street would be used to bring the Davenport Streetcar downtown. Avenue Road, Bay Street, and Yonge Street already had streetcar service, and the TTC, as stated before, wanted to avoid duplication of service. Although, ironically enough, this whole idea would go out the window in the 1940s, with the Bay and DuPont streetcars following nearly the same route. Regardless of that though, at the time this was the TTC's stance on the issue, and if they didn't mind duplication, then the line would have just followed Bathurst Street to begin with. The Davenport Streetcar was in effect caught in limbo, as it didn't go anywhere and company policy at the time prevented it from going anywhere. To the west, there was no room to construct a loop at Davenport Road, and so the Davenport Streetcar would use double-ended cars which turned around via crossovers. Since there was no loop at the west end of the line, there was no incentive to build a loop at the east end of the line either, or loop the route through a loop at the Hillcrest shops. At this point, the Davenport Streetcar was a simple shuttle service, shunting people in the area to either Bathurst Street or Davenport Road, where they could transfer onto lines heading into the downtown core. Ridership on the Davenport Streetcar by this time was quite low, and the route presented itself as a candidate for replacement with buses. While the tracks on the line were practically brand new, the general topography of the area meant that people who lived north of Davenport were more likely to use the St. Clair Streetcar, while people to the south would prefer the DuPont Streetcar. As well, the line was using double-ended cars from the old Toronto Civic Railway, which had begun to age, and the TTC by this point was committed to using single-ended streetcars. In 1926, the TTC would establish a bus route along Oakwood Avenue between Davenport Road and St. Clair Avenue. As the double-ended cars used on the Davenport Streetcar continued to age, the question of what to do with the line became more pressing, and eventually the TTC simply decided it would be better to replace the streetcar with a bus. This bus route would be an extension of the previously mentioned bus route along Oakwood. Even with the shortage of rubber and gasoline caused by World War II, on December 31st, 1940, the TTC abolished the Davenport Streetcar, thus ending 48 years of service. Bus service would commence the next day. Tracks along Davenport Road would disappear within the next 5 years, save for a small stub east of Davenport Road. This stub would sometimes be used as a short turnway for the Davenport Streetcar. While the Davenport Streetcar was gone, service offered by the Davenport Streetcar between Davenport Road and Old Weston Road remained. By 1947, the Davenport Streetcar had made way for the Harbord Streetcar. Service would remain as such until January 21st, 1957, when the Harbord Streetcar was cut back to St. Clarence Avenue. The tracks between Lansdowne Road and Old Weston Road would eventually be paved over. The tracks to Lansdowne Road remained to allow access to the Lansdowne Car House. On March 28, 1958, the 24 Davenport bus was abolished due to low ridership. The final blow to the Davenport Road would come on February 26, 1966, when the Harbord Streetcar was abolished, thus bringing an end to all transit along Davenport Road and ending 74 years of streetcar service on Davenport. By this time, Davenport Road's importance had waned considerably, as multiple north-south roads had by this point traversed the old Lake Iroquois shoreline, and St. Clair Avenue had become the area's main east-west artery. For a couple of years, Davenport Road would have no transit service at all, although this would change on August 15, 1973, when the 18 Caledonia bus was extended to Christie Station via Davenport Road. As ridership along this stretch of the route grew, it would manifest itself as the 127 Davenport bus on April 15, 1984. This bus route still operates today, ferrying passengers between Spadina Station and Townsley Loop. Today, nothing remains of the Davenport Streetcar, and it's hard to find a justification for its return. Any possibility of a new Davenport Streetcar would have to come with the understanding that the route actually has to go somewhere. It was this lack of a natural terminus that ultimately killed the Davenport Streetcar. Now, you can make the claim this was a complete non-issue and the TTC was being silly with their apprehension to duplicating services. You can point to the fact that by 1943 this idea had gone completely out the window, as seen by the DuPont streetcar being routed down Bay Street, thus duplicating service provided by the Bay streetcar. Even today, routes such as the 503 Kingston Road and the 508 Lakeshore duplicate services along pre-existing routes. It is also worth noting that a Davenport streetcar would be a low-use route, and it is safe to say the ridership on the current Davenport bus simply doesn't justify the cost of re-establishing streetcar service on Davenport Road. Now, if for some reason the Davenport streetcar was to come back, to me it would almost certainly run from Gunn's Loop along St. Clair Avenue to Bathurst Station. I see the route being its own route and not an extension of the 511 Bathurst streetcar, as I feel Bathurst Station is the natural terminus of the line. Now, this does mean the Davenport streetcar would duplicate the current 7 Bathurst bus for about 1.2 kilometers. However, this to me is the only realistic option. Running the route to Spadina would be a complete non-starter, as that would require a reconfiguration of Spadina's underground streetcar loop, which isn't happening. You could make the case for looping the line through the current bus loop, although even if that is possible, to me that would seem really inefficient, since Spadina would then have 2 separate streetcar loops and possibly no physical link between the 2 streetcar lines serving the station. Bathurst Station, on the other hand, is already capable of handling streetcars coming from both the north and the south, although streetcars from the north have a tighter squeeze at the station, so a reconfiguration of Bathurst would likely be necessary. That said, a reconfiguration of Bathurst Station would be significantly easier and cheaper than Spadina. I don't see the Davenport streetcars being all that frequent a service, so perhaps capacity upgrades at Bathurst Station's streetcar loop wouldn't need to be as drastic as, say, what happened at Broadview and Dundas West stations. Ultimately though, looking at how the Davenport streetcar ended, you can see that it was another line in which you could ask if it needed to happen at all. The demise of the Davenport streetcar was strictly administrative in nature. The TTC didn't want to duplicate the Bathurst streetcar service. They could have, but they didn't. Perhaps had the TTC not taken the stance it did, the Davenport streetcar could have survived longer, either as its own route or as an eventual extension of the Bathurst streetcar with the opening of the Bloor Danforth subway. Maybe the line survives into today as a part of the 511 Bathurst. Maybe the line becomes part of the 510 Spadina when it entered service in 1997. Or maybe the line is abolished in the 1960s as part of the streetcar abandonment policy owing to the route's low ridership. All that said though, I think the city with as many abolished streetcar lines as Toronto, there are other routes that have a far greater potential and are worth examining more as possible candidates for reinstitution. The Davenport streetcar is really low on the list of possible future streetcar lines, although that in no way rules it out. It just means you shouldn't hold your breath on it ever coming back anytime soon. And with that, I will end this video. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Davenport streetcar, don't be afraid to do so in the comments down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.